Tengo entendido que sí.
Bueno, vamos a ir comenzando. Muchísimas gracias a todos por venir. Sus lugares desde La Plata también. Gracias a todos los que están presentes de manera virtual. Estamos grabando, como ven, desde la computadora, con lo cual nuestro micrófono está un poquito lejos, por lo cual vamos a necesitar silencio en la sala, porque si no va a tomar el audio de la sala. Lo interesante es que tome al profesor Edwin Bryant, que va a estar dando la charla. Bueno, estamos muy contentos de que estemos todos acá, de que el profesor, doctor Edwin Bryant esté acá presente. Voy a leer unas líneas acerca de quién es o qué hace el doctor Edwin Bryant, que es profesor de religión y filosofía hinduista en la Universidad de Rutgers de los Estados Unidos. Recibió su doctorado en lenguas y culturas de la India en la Universidad de Columbia y enseñó hinduismo en la Universidad de Harvard durante 3 años. Publicó 8 libros y numerosos artículos acerca de los orígenes más tempranos de la cultura védica, de la filosofía del yoga y sobre Krishna y su tradición. Entre sus libros más importantes están Krishna, The Beautiful Legend of God, los Yoga Sutras de Patanjali, Bhakti Yoga, Tales and Teachings from the Bhagavad Gītā, Free Will, Agency and Selfhood in Indian Philosophy, entre otros libros. Actualmente se encuentra trabajando en 2 proyectos. Una traducción comentada de la Bhagavad Gītā con referencias a los comentadores tradicionales y en una investigación y defensa de la concepción de lo divino con forma, y eso es acerca de lo cual nos va a hablar hoy, de este proyecto que tiene la forma de un libro. Bueno, muchísimas gracias, Edwin, te cedemos la palabra, y lo último es, yo silencié a todos los que están presentes en el Zoom. Cualquier cosa les pido que se silencien si por algún motivo se les silencian. Y si no escuchan, levanten la manito o algo. Y el último detalle, vamos a hacer más o menos una exposición de 1h20, 1h30, donde debo hablar y yo lo voy traduciendo, y luego va a haber un espacio para preguntas, así podemos hacer al menos una pregunta cada uno si están interesados. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, Professor Martino. It's great to be in Buenos Aires. I have to correct my pronunciation. Aires. I'm sorry I don't speak Spanish. You know, we don't want Anglo colonialization, right? We should respect, but unfortunately I don't speak Spanish. It's frustrating for me because my mother language is Italian. So it's tantalizing because I can understand so much and I want to speak in Italian. And also because there's so many Italians here from the names. It seems like, you know, half the country is Italian origin. But I don't speak Spanish, so I assume many of you speak English, but it would be good to have it translated. Yes. So therefore, we're very grateful for Dr. Martino to do the translation, but I apologize that I can't speak in Spanish.
Bueno, el profesor Bryant está muy contento de estar en Buenos Aires y se disculpa de no poder hablar en español. Dice que no quiere tener, o que parezca el hecho de que él hable en inglés, que hay un intento de una actitud de colonización lingüística, porque él habla inglés, pero bueno, la verdad es que no habla español. De todos modos se siente frustrado porque su lengua madre es el italiano, entonces puede entender todo lo que nosotros hablamos en español y quiere responder en italiano, pero bueno, va a dar su conferencia en inglés y yo lo voy a traducir.
Okay. So the talk was pitched as a defense of A God with Form, and it's a book I'm writing. I've been writing for a few years. I changed the title from Defense of a God with Form to Encounter of a God with Form, because defense has slightly apologetic connotations, and I want it to be pitched mostly in philosophy of religion rather than theology, even though the boundary between theology and philosophy of religion is very porous. It's not a very boundary is very, there's a lot of transition between the two. So the talk is going to be about an encounter of a God with form, but I think in some ways it's defense. So we start off with the idea that Hinduism, okay, which has so many different universes with Hinduism, but really the vast majority of practices that come under this rubric of Hinduism. We know the term is problematic. We're all academics. We know how to problematize categories and words. Okay, but let's just go with the term Hinduism. Essentially, Hinduism is devotion to a form of God with a form. So, first question is, that's the vast majority of practices, not just on the ground, but theologies, rich philosophical traditions. Why is it that these philosophies do not get almost no representation in philosophy departments outside of India? First question. A corollary of that question is, why is it that monistic philosophies, non-form philosophies like Advaita Vedanta, why do they get to be almost representative of intellectual Hinduism? What are the causes? Whereas on the ground, in actual fact, Advaita Vedanta is just a small subsect of Vedanta. I mean, it's prominent, but it's not, certainly not the sole face of intellectual Hinduism. So how does this state of affairs come to be? So that was the motive behind my urge to write this book, to do this research, which then is ending up in a big book.
Muy bien, entonces Edwin, doctor Bryant comienza a recordarnos que el título de esta charla fue presentado como una defensa de la noción de Dios con forma, y es, bueno, un tema acerca del cual él viene escribiendo un libro hace varios años, pero decidió cambiar el título de su libro, que inicialmente llevaba la palabra defensa, con la palabra un encuentro con la noción de lo divino con forma, porque la palabra defensa tenía connotaciones apologéticas y porque él quería que su libro fuera, digamos, incorporado o perteneciera a la disciplina de la filosofía de la religión más que de la teología, aunque él comenta los límites entre la filosofía de la religión y la teología son bastante porosos y hay mucho intercambio entre ambas disciplinas. Entonces, la idea general es que el hinduismo, si bien esta es una categoría problemática, ¿sí? En la academia se ha discutido mucho acerca de los problemas de la categoría hinduismo, y en el seminario que nosotros tuvimos de yoga este año pudimos problematizar en alguna medida esta categoría, y si bien hay muchos universos conceptuales diferentes en lo que llamamos hinduismo, en la mayoría, ¿sí? En la gran mayoría de las prácticas del hinduismo se da que hay una devoción, ¿sí? Y un culto a una forma de Dios con forma, ¿sí? Y esto no solo se da en el terreno de la práctica, sino también en el terreno de la teología. Entonces, siendo esta la situación, el doctor Bryant postula dos interrogantes que guiaron su investigación. El primer interrogante es ¿por qué estas teologías y estas prácticas que involucran la concepción de lo divino con forma no son representados en los departamentos de filosofía fuera de India? ¿Sí? Si uno ve cuando se estudia filosofía de la India en alguna universidad europea o norteamericana, bueno, las corrientes conciben a lo divino con forma, al cual se rinde culto en el hinduismo, no tienen un lugar, digamos, como la teoría filosófica. Y como corolario de esa primera pregunta, hay una segunda pregunta, que es ¿por qué la corriente monista de pensamiento, como es el Advaita Vedanta, es la que copa, por decirlo así, ¿sí? Acapara toda o la mayoría de las representaciones de lo que sería el hinduismo? Y entonces el hinduismo es una multiplicidad de corrientes, la mayoría de los cuales es una concepción de lo divino con forma, pero en las universidades europeas y norteamericanas, cuando se estudia filosofía de la India, se estudia principalmente una corriente monista de la Advaita Vedanta, que es una que tiene una concepción de lo divino sin forma.
Yeah, just as an anecdotal, do you know the Encyclopedia of Indian Philosophy by Potter? It's huge, multi-volume, right? So they have Abhidharma Buddhism, they have Kriya-Dvaita Vedanta, Vedanta, they have 20 of philosophy. And I approached the editor and I said, well, let's do a volume on the philosophy of Bhakti, which is situated in the Puranas. The Bhakti traditions come in a genre of text called the Puranas. Let's do a volume on the philosophy of the Puranas, meaning form philosophies. And he responded that that's not philosophy, that's mythology. So therefore, there's this attitude in Western intellectual circles that form traditions are mythological, okay? And we know what that means. Mythos is something which is folk tales, rustic, not very sophisticated, right? As opposed to logos. Logos is reason and rationalism. But mythos is something which is essentially not true, right? Maybe it has some moral value, maybe it has some cultural value, but it's not historically true for sure, and it has no deep philosophical grounding. And so these forms of these expressions of Hinduism, which essentially are 90% of Hinduism, I don't know, we'll sit down and do a statistic, but the vast majority of Hindu practices are form-based, form I mean body. But they are considered to be mythological. So then if we relegate them into the category of mythology, then we don't have to engage with them philosophically. They are therefore philosophically unworthy. Maybe anthropologists are interested in them. Maybe other kinds of academic enterprises might find them of some kind of use. So this was the context, I think. I don't know if you agree with that. It's certainly my own 45 years in the field of Hinduism, many years living in India. That's certainly my conviction. So, and can I just say one quick thing? So theology and philosophy of religion, I'm sure you don't need me to say this, but technically speaking, a theologian is a philosopher, completely and utterly erudite, completely schooled in the intellectual currents of the day and age, and he engages all of those in support of a theological position. That's technically a theologian. Philosophy of religion is engaging the same things. God, is there a God, good, evil, morality? However, not technically speaking, not committed to a canonical revelation. In actual fact, the boundaries are very porous because everybody has a belief position. So whether it's a Christian or a biblical or a Hindu one, or whether it's some other kind of belief system, everybody is. So so technically, if there is a difference between philosophy of religion and theology, it might be something like that, but they're not hard and fast boundaries. So just the way to put that out there. He's very good. We've done this many times. He has a siddhi, the siddhis in yoga, the powers in yoga, the chapter Patanjali. He has a siddhi that he has an amazing.
Entonces Edwin nos comentaba acerca de la enciclopedia de filosofía de la India, editada en el siglo XX por Potter, publicada por Motilal. Sí, es muy amplia, muy completa, muy buena, que tiene volúmenes sobre budismo, sobre Vedanta, sobre Nyaya, sobre Vaisheshika, sobre yoga, sobre Samkhya, y el profesor Bryant se acercó a Potter, al editor de esta enciclopedia, y le dijo, ¿por qué no hacemos un volumen sobre filosofía Bhakti que encontramos en los Purana? Entonces el editor le dijo, no, eso no es filosofía, eso es mitología. Entonces no cabería dentro de esta enciclopedia, ¿no? Entonces, claro, esta distinción entre filosofía y mitología es una presuposición que podemos ver operando detrás de estos dos interrogantes que él planteaba acerca de, bueno, ¿por qué esas concepciones del divino como forma no están presentes en los departamentos de filosofía europeos, norteamericanos, etcétera, ¿no? Como elementos valiosos de la filosofía de la Biblia. Y uno podría decir, dice Edwin, bueno, si vemos también una distinción entre mitología y filosofía es la distinción entre mitos y logos, donde mitos habla de narraciones tradicionales que no serían muy sofisticadas, tal vez tengan un valor cultural, pero no son consideradas verdaderas, ¿sí? Y no tienen un fundamento sólido, profundo, histórico, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, eso es lo que está operando detrás de este rechazo de posiblemente el 90% de las tradiciones hindúes filosóficas que conciben a lo divino por forma. Tal vez son estudiados por otras disciplinas como la antropología, pero no en general por la filosofía. Y esa es un poco la experiencia que él ha tenido en más de sus 45 años en este campo de la filosofía de la India y de los estudios de la religión, y también con los muchos años que él ha vivido en India. Y agrega el profesor Bryant una distinción que él propone entre el filósofo y el teólogo, donde el teólogo, si bien está perfectamente formado como filósofo, y es un filósofo, y está formado en las corrientes filosóficas de su época, defiende y tiene un compromiso con una determinada posición teológica, por ser una u otra. Entonces es un filósofo que pone su filosofía al servicio de esa convicción. Mientras que el filósofo no necesariamente está comprometido con una determinada revelación canónica y no pondría al servicio de esa filosofía de esa revelación. Entonces, si hay alguna diferencia entre la filosofía y la teología, se propone esta, aunque plantea que no habría límites duros y estrictos.
Pero se c'è una mitologia, questa è la mitologia.
Pero si hay algo mitológico, tal vez esta distinción sea una de las.
So then perhaps the next question can be, Hindus, we can't generalize, but we can't have language if we don't have some kind of generalization. So let's say the vast majority of Hindu intellectual and ritualistic and praxis is form-based. Is the adoration of Shiva and Vishnu and Krishna and the goddess and the Shakti traditions. So why do we need to mount a defense of divine form? Who are we defending it from? So that's going to be the next question. Why do we need to sort of even to use this language, even though we changed the title to counter? Why do we need a defense of a divine form? Hindus don't need to defend their divine forms. It's natural for them. It's obvious for them. It's that God manifests these infinite forms, and such that the devotee can approach carefully. Not that the forms depends on the tradition now. Hindu is not a generic one-size-fits-all. We say the forms are mediums through which we approach something else, then we're entering into the realm of monism, okay, which is pretty much how it's going to be presented in Western intellectual circles. That okay, we can accept these forms as a secondary, preliminary kind of for those whose minds are not sophisticated enough to go beyond form, material, familiar material things. So form is necessary in order to sort of approach something beyond form. If we start using that kind of language, we are actually entering into the realm of monism, which would be something like Advaita Vedanta would be quite happy with. But the specifically the Vaishnava traditions and Shaiva Siddhanta traditions vigorously oppose that. Rigorously, Ramanuja, a fifth of his entire commentary of Vedanta Sutra is a rebuttal and rejection of the Advaita Vedanta. So I'm talking about form traditions where the form is ultimate, not a lens or a medium or a mental prop for our limited minds with our samskaras, and we can't break out of our lenses, and so therefore we need like Joseph Campbell might have said, a mask of God. We're not talking about that, even though that's convenient, the way it's conveniently pitched in a lot of religious talk in Western academy. I'm interested in the traditions where form is ultimate. Why does that need a defense? And that's the question that I present here.
Entonces, el doctor Bryant nos comenta que si bien no podemos generalizar, la generalización por otra parte es inevitable, no podríamos tener lenguaje si no generalizáramos, podríamos decir que la mayoría de los intelectuales hinduistas la mayoría de las prácticas propias del hinduismo están basadas en la adoración a una forma de Dios. Y esto se da tanto para las corrientes Shaivas, para las corrientes que hablan a Krishna, a Vishnu, a la diosa, etc. ¿Sí? Con lo cual, una de las preguntas que él se formula es ¿por qué hablar de una defensa de la noción de lo divino con forma? Si esta noción es prácticamente la preponderante en el hinduismo, y para los hindúes no hay tal necesidad de defender lo que sería obvio para ellos, de que la noción de lo divino está asociada a una determinada forma. ¿Sí? Lo divino incluso manifiesta infinitas formas. ¿Sí? Entonces la primera pregunta, o una nueva pregunta que se formula es, ¿defenderlo de quién? ¿Sí? Y acá tenemos que tener cuidado, dice el profesor Bryant, de cómo concebimos a la forma, cómo él concibe la forma en esta propuesta, en su investigación, que no hay que tomar a la forma, o él no toma la forma, como un medio para acceder a algo que está más allá de la forma y que carece de forma. Este sería un discurso propio de las tradiciones monistas, como la Advaita Vedanta, que concibe a la forma así como algo secundario, como algo preliminar, que una mente no entrenada necesita tomar contacto primero con esa forma para luego acceder a algo que carece de forma y que estaría más allá. Esto es propio de una tradición específica o de una serie de tradiciones específicas y no de otras tradiciones. Esa sería la tradición, por ejemplo, de la Advaita Vedanta. Ahora, otras tradiciones como el Shaiva Vedanta, las tradiciones Vaishnavas, Shaiva Siddhanta o las tradiciones Vaishnavas, consideran la forma como último, ¿sí? No es que después de la forma estaría lo que carece de forma, no, sino que la forma es lo último. Incluso hay un comentario Vaishnava del Vedanta Sutra que se dedica a criticar la interpretación advaita del Vedanta Sutra, ¿sí? Entonces no pensemos a la forma en el sentido que Joseph Campbell, que es un autor del siglo XX, tiene varios libros, uno de los cuales se tituló Las máscaras de Dios, ¿sí? Como si la forma fuera la máscara de algo que está por detrás que carece de forma. No, la forma es el principio último.
And just a side comment, Advaita Vedanta, prior to colonialism, right, it was one sub-school. It was not a dominant philosophical tradition. It becomes dominant in Calcutta amongst the Bengali intelligentsia in response to the theological critique of missionaries that how can you believe that God is a form? And therefore, it's a convenient response because Advaita Vedanta allows you to say that, well, these forms are really, they're really superimpositions, they're not real, right? Mithya, and the truth is formless. So therefore, Advaita Vedanta becomes a very handy way of, even though the Brahma Samaj wasn't particularly happy about it, but let's not get into that. That's not the point of where I want to go with this. But Advaita Vedanta, which has now become almost normative as the kind of intellectual face of Hinduism, it's a historical construct. The fact that it's become so dominant has its own genealogy, which goes back into especially Bengal in the colonial period. I just want to throw that out there. It is by no means normative or dominant in the pre-colonial period. You have Mimamsa, you have Nyaya, and all of them opposing Advaita Vedanta. Mimamsa opposes it, Nyaya opposes it, Sankhya opposes it, Yoga opposes, well, there's not much yoga philosophy. The Buddhist, so Advaita Vedanta is rebutted by all and the majority of Vedanta traditions, the Vaishnava traditions, vigorously rebut Advaita Vedanta. So prior to the colonial period, Advaita Vedanta was one sub-branch of one of the many, and the idea of 6 schools of philosophy, total fiction, but Advaita Vedanta was one of many, numerous schools of philosophy, all of which oppose the idea that the world is the world, including God with form, is a superimposition. So just wanted to throw that out.
Entonces, el doctor Bryant hace un comentario al margen, es que si bien en la actualidad encontramos como principal representación del hinduismo la corriente monista de la Advaita Vedanta o no dualista, con anterioridad a la época colonial, en absoluto el Advaita Vedanta tenía un papel preponderante o un papel normativo como intelectualismo, en el intelectualismo del hinduismo. Este papel normativo que adquiere puede rastrearse y puede retrotraerse sobre todo al periodo colonial en Calcuta, donde la intelectualidad bengalí toma la Advaita Vedanta como una estrategia de refutación de las propuestas de los misioneros cristianos que criticaban las concepciones de lo divino por forma. Entonces se encontró en la Advaita Vedanta una manera de decir que bueno, la forma es secundaria a lo que carece de forma. Entonces, de ninguna manera pensemos que ese papel normativo es tradicional, ¿sí? De hecho, en la tradición vemos, antes de la colonia, que todas las escuelas se dedican a criticar a la Advaita Vedanta, el Nyaya, el budismo, el Samkhya, las tradiciones Vaishnavas. Entonces, la Advaita Vedanta es una subrama de una de las muchas escuelas que se oponen a esta idea de que la forma de lo divino, incluso el mundo, son superimposiciones sobre algo que carece de forma.
Okay, so therefore the question is, samskara component. Do you know what a samskara is? Yes, you know what a samskara is. Anything you perceive, right, enters in your mind, and it's now lodged in your mind. Any observation of this, the way you use the language of Sankhya, contact of the sense with sense object, leaves a samskara in the chitta, and that's a samskara. Now we have our individual samskaras, but we also have cultural samskaras. So we have cultural samskaras coming in so-called Western, okay, now that's a problematic category, but let's just go with Western civilization, which is essentially a confluence of Hellenistic and biblical. I know there's there's Egyptian, and there's, and we know all of that. You can problematize these categories. That's what academics do, and so they should do. But let's just go for now. Two of the main confluences in Western culture are Hellenistic and biblical. So there's certain samskaras that get handed down from the Old Testament, not from the Old Testament and the exegesis of the Old Testament, that sort of permeate Western intellectuality. I know I'm essentializing, but I really think I can essentialize. And if you want to challenge me, challenge me. Permeates Western, for want of a better category, intellectuality right into the colonial period. And I'm going to identify one such massive, well, obviously that God cannot have a form. And I want to, and the next part of this little talk, I want to try to trace, where does that come from? Given that Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, is massively anthropomorphic, overwhelmingly anthropomorphic. It's just a huge book just came out. I forget the name, but it's struggles. 670 vowels, I don't pronounce it. I can never memorize his name. This book just came out, it's 26 chapters. God's hand in the Old Testament, his head in the Old Testament, his loins, she loves that bit, his loins and his penis in the Old Testament, his voice in the Old Testament, 26 chapters, each chapter dedicated to the anthropomorphic God of the Old Testament. What happened to that? And that's a big part of our story.
Entonces, el profesor Bryant nos comenta acerca de los samskaras, ¿no? Y desde la filosofía Sankhya, los samskaras son el resultado de una percepción, por ejemplo. Entonces, por un ejemplo, cuando tenemos un objeto y nos tenemos nuestros sentidos, con los cuales percibimos ese objeto, y esa sensación deja un samskara, una impresión en nuestra mente, en nuestra chitta, ¿sí? Así como hay samskaras personales, también hay samskaras culturales. Y podríamos hablar en términos generales, si bien son problemáticos, pero Rubén reconoce el problema de utilizar estas categorías a la civilización occidental, que se puede, de manera muy simplista, obviamente problemática, y él favorece y promueve que lo cuestionemos al final de la charla, básicamente en dos grandes esferas culturales como contribuyen a esta civilización occidental. Una es la filosofía helenística, la filosofía griega, y otra es la tradición bíblica. Y
But we have to do namaha to the Egyptians and
sin olvidarnos de la cultura egipcia, la cultura romana, etcétera, etcétera, etcétera. Bueno, entonces, tomando esto, pensemos que en el Antiguo Testamento y la tradición exegética del Antiguo Testamento nos transmiten, digamos, o desde esa tradición nos llega un samskara que permea prácticamente toda la tradición intelectual occidental hasta el periodo colonial, pues que viene estudiando, y es la noción de que Dios no tiene una forma. Y se pregunta entonces, ¿de dónde proviene esta noción? Ya que en el Antiguo Testamento, Yahvé es caracterizado de manera antropomórfica, de una manera muy enfática. Y menciona un libro del cual no se acuerda la autora.
no ricordo, non so pronunciare, no.
Ah, sí, que recuerdo. Do you want to write?
No, I don't even know. It's got something.
Ah, okay.
I have to sit and do a samadhi on the name. Fix it in. Tarana.
Entonces, en este libro hay 26 capítulos dedicados a las distintas menciones antropomórficas de Dios. Por ejemplo, el capítulo dedicado a la mano de Yahvé, de Yahvé, el peine de Yahvé, la voz de Yahvé, etc. Entonces, no sería realmente una concepción del Antiguo Testamento, pero nos llega de esa tradición.
So we'll focus on the Christian tradition because we're interested in certain cultural presuppositions encountering the Hindu deities in the 16th century, beginning with the Portuguese and on to the British colonialism. So we'll start with the Christians, but we have with the same tensions in the Judaic exegetical tradition and the same tension in the Quranic exegetical tradition. The Quran is also anthropomorphic, especially the Hadith. That's very interesting Hadith, with Muhammad having a vision of God as a young man, right? Dressed in green, of course, with the Hadith, and you don't like it, and challenge the Hadith, but very robust, strong Hadith traditions that have all of the criteria that any accepted Hadith has. But we won't talk about the, book I'm writing as a chapter on the Quran, a chapter on the Judaic tradition, very important, especially the Judaic tradition. But we'll focus on the Christian exegetical tradition. Okay, so you have a very anthropomorphic God in the Old Testament, and for the first 2-3 centuries of the Christian era, Christians all accepted, embraced, worshipped, adored a God with form. Okay. The term anthropomorphic, I don't use that for the Indian traditions, but we'll use it for the Western traditions because it's been used that way. When it comes to India, we have to be very careful at appropriating Western terminologies and imposing them, because that's a type of colonial colonization, intellectual, vernacular colonialization. Actually, these terms in the study of religion come from Protestant, post-Enlightenment Protestant categories. So be very careful about using terms in the West and applying them to Indian. Number one, be careful of that. Number two, how about it's time that Western academics stepped out of their box and started learning some Sanskrit terms? What's wrong with that? How about we start familiarizing ourselves, if you want to be intellectual citizens of the world, with some Sanskrit terminology? So it seems to me that's probably a good idea, especially in our day and age, so that we shouldn't be using Western terminologies for Indian concepts. We might use them once to create a bridge, say, okay, here's a little bridge, okay, form, whatever, saguna, whatever you can say, but that's it. Maybe once or twice, and then use the native term. So, but anyway, okay. So the first 3 centuries, actually, it's an important point, by the way. If you're studying Hinduism or any other non-Western tradition, we should be using the terms and concepts of our tradition. At this point in time, it's a global interreligious environment that we have inhabited. It's not medieval in Middle Ages anymore. Indians living all over Indians, you know, the diaspora, all over the world of every country. So first couple of centuries, 2-3 centuries, Christian very naturally considered God to have a form. Let's
nos vamos a concentrar en la tradición cristiana, si bien el profesor Bryant en su libro tiene un capítulo dedicado al Corán, otro capítulo dedicado a la tradición judaica, en este momento le interesa que revisemos algunas de las presuposiciones que están presentes en nuestro pensamiento, provenientes de la tradición cristiana y que están presentes en nuestra apropiación del pensamiento de la India desde el siglo XVI en adelante, con la llegada de los portugueses a la India y con las subsiguientes interacciones con culturas europeas de la India. Incluso el Corán también tiene sobre todo la corriente hadith de exégesis del Corán, tiene una concepción.
Is what Gabriel imparted to Muhammad in the hill. The hadith are the stories from his followers about Muhammad and what he said and his activities, and they just sort of and they eventually collected by the theologians, and they had a criteria of which one do we accept as valid, which don't. So they were a deep collection, and in time they become pretty fossilized. The hadith in which the vision occurred is the most reliable by those criteria of authentication, the most reliable.
Entonces, él o la hadith son colecciones de historias de los seguidores de Mohammed o de Mahoma, en las cuales se narran las historias de Mahoma. Y una de esas historias es acerca de la visión que Mahoma tiene de Dios como un hombre joven. Y este texto, donde encontramos esta historia, es uno de los más aceptados por los distintos criterios que la misma tradición utiliza.
It's been rejected in modern recently, but for no good reason other than that. It follows the criteria, the methodology of identifying what is a bona fide hadith. It follows all of those, and so therefore, why was it rejected? Not because the
Who rejected it?
Well, eventually the Islamic, community, all Islamic.
Entonces, durante muchos siglos, esta historia satisfacía todos los criterios tradicionales, por los cuales se considera una historia legítima, pero en el último tiempo fue dejada de lado por las distintas comunidades islámicas, ¿sí? Posiblemente por estas mismas presuposiciones de que Dios no debería tener una forma, de las formas que estamos lidiando nosotros. Entonces, durante los primeros siglos de la era cristiana, el pensamiento cristiano, gran parte aceptaba y adoraba un Dios con forma. Y el profesor Bryant utiliza el término antropomórfico para caracterizar esta concepción de lo divino en la tradición cristiana, pero comenta que no utiliza este término para la tradición o las tradiciones hinduistas. Además es un término, que tiene su propia historia y que no se aplica a la historia o a las historias del hinduismo. Y propone, por otra parte, que deberíamos, y los académicos deberían, aprender términos sánscritos, la terminología sánscrita y nativa, para estudiar luego las tradiciones de hinduismo, ¿sí? Que esas tradiciones sean caracterizadas con la misma terminología nativa y no imponiéndole categorías ajenas propias de otras tradiciones.
Okay, so I'm going to just paint with very broad brushstrokes. So essentially what happens is around the 3rd century, Christianity doesn't have much intellectual respect. It's in a Hellenistic, and the Near East is pervaded by Hellenistic culture and philosophy, and Christians are considered to be simpletons, worshipping their God and not very erudite. So the early church fathers, the dharma of a theologian, the duty of a theologian is to give intellectual dignity to a tradition. So the early church fathers, Origen, Tertullian, and others, were all actually Greek philosophers before they converted to Christianity. So they were conversions to Christianity. At a certain point, sophisticated intellectuals in the context of the time became convinced by the by the claims of Christianity, and they brought Greek philosophy into their attempt to present an intellectually sophisticated Christian theology. The Christian theology is essentially, because the New Testament is not philosophical, the Bible is not philosophical. So you basically have the early church fathers, and eventually Augustine, and then by the time you get to Aquinas, it reaches its pinnacle. You basically have these theologians borrowing their philosophical categories from the Greeks. And to cut a long story short, in Greek philosophy, any type of form, here's the important thing. Any type of form is morphe, anthropomorphism. Any type of form is a material product with all of the defects of materiality. So a form is a product. A product means it's a combination of material ingredients. And if something is a combination of material ingredients, it's reducible. Here is a form, but it's made of parts. So therefore, the assumption is any form, any body is a combination of things. And if you separate that body does not exist anymore. So it is incoherent to talk about an eternal form, because all forms are, here's the word, reducible. They can be reduced to parts. Number one. Number two, forms are limited. The form is here, it's not there. So it is incoherent to talk about an eternal God and an infinite God, and then say God has a form. Repeat that. Yes, it's really important. If this philosophy is being brought into Christianity and Judaism, and eventually Islam. We don't have time to go there.
So we're all around the way.
Fashionably New York City lady. Swagatam. This is very important, so I'm going to repeat it. We're talking about a God with form. Why do Christian missionaries, when they encounter these Indian deities, why do they feel this is a philosophically impoverished and non-defensible and incoherent idea? God cannot have a form. Where does that come from? Given that the Bible is anthropomorphic, given that God clearly has a form in the Bible, and so therefore we identified a certain context. First 300 years, Christians accepted God with form. Around the 3rd century, certain, Christians were just considered kind of like not very sophisticated, not to be taken seriously, no intellectual dignity. So then certain Greek intellectuals converted to Christianity, bringing their Hellenistic sophistication with them, and not like that. I don't like the idea that they look down upon, that to become a Christian, you somehow taking a step backwards intellectually. So therefore, they bring in Hellenistic categories, Aristotelian, Platonic, and so forth. They bring them in, and you don't find these in the Old Testament or the New Testament. They bring these categories in, and they construct a theology with many ingredients. But the one we're interested in is one of the ingredients imported from Aristotle and Plato through Tertullian, through Origen, and various Justinian. One of the ingredients that's imported in is that all form is, number one, material, not conscious, material. Number two, reducible. Reducible means this has a form of a pen, but if I take out this and I pull out this, well, let's go with the table like the Buddha. Let's go with the Buddha. This is the table that has a form. Anything with a form If I take off the leg, take off this leg, take off this leg, take off this leg, pull off the top, I don't have a form anymore. I have bits and pieces, and I can take one of the bits and say, oh, I have a leg, but you can do the same to the leg. You break it apart. So any form is reducible. You can reduce it to its parts. Therefore what? Therefore what? Therefore to speak of an eternal God with a form is incoherent, because no forms are eternal. They are reducible. If it's reducible, it can't be eternal. Yes? And number two, yes? Number two, yes.
Bueno, entonces el doctor Bryant comenta que va a hacer un esquema con pinceladas gruesas, pero a grandes rasgos comenta que en los primeros siglos de la era cristiana, los cristianos no eran considerados como intelectualmente muy sofisticados, por sobre todo los intelectuales de la época, que eran muchos de ellos filósofos de la tradición griega, ¿sí? Pero muchos de los, o algunos de los primeros padres de la iglesia, como Origen, Tertuliano, y otros, inicialmente fueron filósofos griegos que luego se convirtieron al cristianismo, con lo cual traen de la tradición griega muchas de las categorías con las que interpretan, o con las que interpretan, dan cuerpo a la teología cristiana, ¿sí? Muy bien, y uno de los conceptos principales es que toda forma corpórea, toda forma corpórea es una combinación y como tal es reductible a sus partes, ¿sí? Entonces, al ser reductible, sería incoherente pensar en un Dios eterno e infinito que a su vez tiene una forma corpórea. Además, la forma corpórea es limitada, con lo cual nuevamente es incoherente pensar en un Dios con una forma corpórea limitada y reductible que a su vez es eterno e infinito. Y esto es una concepción que traen estos primeros padres de la Iglesia, de la filosofía griega, principalmente de Platón y Aristóteles, de que toda forma corpórea es reductible a sus partes, con lo cual si yo desarmo esa forma, ya no tengo una forma, sino que tengo partes. Y lo mismo puedo hacer con las partes, desarmarla y ya no tengo ni siquiera esa parte, sino partes más pequeñas.
And then point number two is limitation. I think I said that. Okay, form is limited, right? So the table is here. Anything with a form, by definition, is situated in space, and it has a form because it's different from other things. If it wasn't different from other things, it'd be monism. If it would be monism, everything would be the same. So to have a form, then that form has to be distinct from other forms, and if a form is distinct from other forms, then it cannot be infinite. It has to be spatially located. So that's the second reason why supposing that God has a form, if you want to then say God is infinite and eternal, if your God wants to be eternal and infinite, then God cannot have a form, because the form is limited, not infinite, number one, reducible, and that means not eternal. Yes, if I reduce the table, here's the table, I take the legs off, it's gone. The table is gone. If it's gone, it is no longer a table. If it is no longer a table, it is not eternal. So these are the two presuppositions about form. We're going to challenge those when we get to India. What we're doing now is we're trying to establish, where does form aversion, where does the resistance, the theological resistance to God having a form, Shiva, Krishna, Vishnu, where is the theological, samskaric, cultural resistance coming from? And we're identifying some of the ingredients. Okay, and then now we're going to jump 1,000 years, and we're going to be first Portuguese missionaries get on a boat, go somewhere, they say, take us to your gods, and they to come take them to a religion, and they see the temple. So we're going to jump 1,000 years. But this is the samskaras they bring with them when they see when they encounter a godly form. Okay.
Y el segundo problema es que si pensamos a lo divino con una forma corpórea, entonces es limitado. porque si tiene una forma corpórea, tiene diferencia respecto de otras formas y por lo tanto no es infinita. Por lo tanto, si hay que decir que Dios es infinito y eterno, no puede tener una forma corpórea. Volvemos al ejemplo de la mesa tiene partes. Si yo divido esa mesa en sus partes, entonces al estar divididas ya no tengo más la mesa, con lo cual esa mesa no es eterna. ¿Sí? Entonces, con esta breve descripción, a grandes rasgos, se está caracterizando esa versión que luego los primeros europeos, colonizadores, portugueses, llegan a la India 1000 años después de lo que estamos contando, posiblemente a Goa, y les dicen a los indios, bueno, llévenos a sus templos para ver a su dios, y se encuentran con los dioses indios y traen esos samskaras en sus mentes. 6:30.
Okay, we're only like a quarter of the way through. All right, so let's jump. Okay, so we have to. Another problem is that Europeans encountered the deities, and that's a whole other issue. The avatara, Murti avatara, the divine presence manifesting in form. That was just blocked because of the Old Testament, thou shalt not worship the graven image, because of, Moses comes down the 10 commandments, and all the Israelites are worshiping the golden calf and praise it. So these samskaras of absolute abhorrence to the graven image, you know how to say that in Spanish, are also obviously pervade, and you can generalize. You know, it's a very bad thing to generalize in academia. Our first lesson in humanities, don't get lesson number 1, boys and girls, no generalization, no essentialization, but I think we can. So we can say, because I have found no exceptions, and if you can find one, give it to me. So I've been looking at this for 5 years. I found no exception to Western utter disregard and disrespect and projection of this Abrahamic, aversion to the deities. I found no narrative in missionary, colonial, and even people sympathetic trying to have a cup of tea with a Brahmin. No, I've had no suggestion at all that there's any possibility of having an intellectual conversation about deities. But we're not talking about deities. We're talking about God on high. Okay? The deity is like the Holy Communion, transubstantiation. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about God on high with form. So let's jump to that. But one of the reasons why the theology of God, the possibility of God with a form, wasn't even engaged, there wasn't even recognition that there was theology. One of the reasons is because of the deities. That simply blocked any further exploration or attempt at conversation. Finished. Door shut.
Pues si bien no se va a hablar de la noción de deity en inglés, hace referencia a, por ejemplo, las esculturas, ¿sí? En las cuales se manifiesta la divinidad. ¿Sí? Más allá de Dios con forma, que tiene su forma, también la escultura, a la escultura se le puede hacer una adoración porque ahí se está manifestando la divinidad en esa imagen esculpida, ¿sí? Pero en la tradición abrahámica y en adelante hay una versión a esta idea. Pensemos en la historia de Moisés con sus 10 mandamientos, que baja con las tablas y estaban parte de su pueblo adorando al becerro de oro, que es justamente una deity, digamos. Bueno, si bien dos de los principios de las humanidades son no generalizar y no esencializar, el doctor Bryant comenta que en los 5 años que viene estudiando esto, encuentra un rechazo y una versión generalizada de la tradición occidental frente a la noción de lo divino con una forma. Y sobre todo por la presencia de las deidades, que son estas imágenes esculpidas, se cierra la puerta, digamos, a la idea.
sorry.
En el periodo colonial, ¿sí?
And the missionary colonial meaning 16th century to the 20th century. Yeah.
En el periodo colonial, desde el siglo XIX, por ahí hasta el siglo XX, este rechazo generalizado por parte de, sobre todo, la intelectualidad occidental, de aceptar que hay una teología detrás de la concepción de lo divino con forma, sobre todo por la existencia de las deidades.
Okay, so we're running out of time, so let's jump a few chapters, let's jump lots of interesting aspects and ingredients of this problem. And let's just go to what is the Vaishnava defense of form? What does that look like? Because the Vaishnavas accept a God with form as ultimate. Ultimate, okay? The form is eternal. Advaita Vedanta accepts. In Advaita Vedanta, to the extent the world is real, it must have an Ishvara. And that Ishvara is Vishnu with a form. To the Vyavaharika, to the extent the world is real and there is a creation, there must be a creator, and that creator is Vishnu. So Shankara accepted God with form. It's just the peculiarity of his philosophy is that all form is mithya and superimposed, and ultimate paramarthika reality is formless. But pay attention to that. Actually, he accepts God with form to the extent that the world is real, to the extent there's trees out there, God has a form. But ultimately, all forms are false. Okay, so that's point number one. So the traditions that, probably the prominent traditions in India are the Vaishnava traditions, but the Vedanta traditions, Madhva, Ramanuja, the Chico Swamis, the 16th century, the great Vaishnava theologians. What does their defense of the God with form look like? Okay, so we'll say something about that.
Entonces, saltando un poco hacia el entorno, al contexto ya del hinduismo, el doctor Bryant va a abordar ahora la defensa que hace la tradición Vaishnava, sobre todo, bueno, sí, los teólogos Vaishnavas como Madhva y Ramanuja, entre otros, de la noción de lo divino con forma, y señala que esta forma de lo divino es concebida como último, no es que detrás de esa forma hay algo que carece de forma. Y el razonamiento general es que si el mundo es concebido como real y el mundo es una creación, tiene que haber un creador que haga esa creación real, y ese creador es Ishvara, que es Dios con forma.
So Shankara,
Incluso Shankara,
Sankhya near Ishvara, he debates against them. No, that must be an Ishvara.
incluso Shankara, que es el principal filósofo de la tradición Advaita Vedanta, acepta que si la creación es real, tiene que haber un creador, un Ishvara, y por lo tanto rechaza a los Nirishvaravadins, Samkhya, de la tradición Samkhya, que niegan la existencia de un Ishvara. Incluso desde la perspectiva hipotética, digamos, para Shankara, si el mundo es real, tiene que haber un creador. Pero bueno, para Shankara el mundo no va a ser real.
Okay, so what's the Vaishnava defense? First of all, have you heard the term Sadguna Brahman? Sadguna, guna means quality. Don't think that guna means property. Property has qualities, gunas, and Brahman has qualities, gunas. So the gunas of property are sattva, rajas, and tamas. These are the gunas, the quality. Quality means guna is a quality. This has a quality. It has a form, it has a color, it has a texture. These are gunas. So guna simply means quality. How you use it is up to you. So the Sankhya tradition uses guna when it talks about property, and it says property has these gunas, but Brahman has guna. For example, Chit is a guna of Brahman. Ananda, you've heard of Satchit Ananda. These are gunas, these are properties, these are qualities. So the Vaishnava Vedantins posit that Brahman has a Saguna aspect, which is ultimate, the highest aspect. And that means that God has a form. Because Saguna means qualities, and God has Bhagavan. What does it mean? Van, the possessor of Bhagas. The term Bhagavan, or Ishvara just means power, right? Yeah, Ishvara just means creator, because Ishvara means the Ishvara, Ish. the one with the most power. What's the most powerful thing you can do in our frame of reference? Create a universe. We only know about the universe, so we can't talk about anything else. So therefore, the most powerful thing you can do is create a universe. So therefore, that's what Ishvara means, the creator of the universe. Now, having established that, the Vaishnavas say, okay, by reason you can go that far. By reason you can say there must be intelligence, right? There must be intelligence behind the creation of the universe. Fifth Sutra, Vedanta Sutra. Ikshater, right? Jamadya Sayataha. In Brahman is that Tato Brahma Jignasa. Let's talk about Brahman, Jamadya Sayataha. Brahman is that from which creation comes. And Ikshater, it is intelligent. So, and then the Vaishnavas say, yeah, reason can take you that far, but you don't know what kind of intelligence. You don't know if it's one intelligence, maybe it's two. Maybe it's like Descartes said, maybe it's malevolent. What if there's a demon, right? All you know is intelligence. So if you want to know anything else, it has to be revealed by that Ishvara. And so when Ishvara reveals himself, herself in the Bhagavad Gītā tradition, so that gender careful, not gender neutral, gender careful. There's male and female. I'm going to obliterate that if we wish to respect the theology. So when Ishvara manifests, reveals, and then he reveals bhagas, which is another word for gunas, properties. Okay, so let's stop there. So then bhaga means the properties of God. Okay, and such as omniscience, omnipotency, and the six main bhagas, but infinite bhagas, and we're interested in the bhaga form. And why should one of the bhagas? Why should one of the properties of God be form? We can accept the property of omniscience, because if you create, you have to know what you write. The Nyaya says, if you make something, well, you have to know what all the bits and pieces, so that you can make it. You have to know what this is. And so if you make something, you have to know the ingredients. And so therefore, if you're making the universe, you have to know all the ingredients of the universe, and that means omniscient. And you have the power to do it. So that means omnipotent. Now, all theists will accept that. They'll accept those two properties. Why then the property of form and will and the rupa? Why the rupa? Why is rupa a necessary form property of God? Okay, and we'll say something about that, and we'll try to another time.
Entonces, Dr. Bryant comienza recuperando la noción de guna, que nosotros solemos entender la noción de guna como sattva, rajas y tamas, que es cierto, pero la noción de guna es más amplia. ¿Sí? Esa es la apropiación que el Samkhya, por ejemplo, hace de los gunas para hablar de prakriti. Pero consideremos al término guna como significando cualidad. Entonces, prakriti, para el Samkhya, por ejemplo, tiene sus cualidades, sattva, rajas y tamas, pero Brahman también tiene su guna. Hemos hablado, por ejemplo, hemos escuchado hablar, por ejemplo, de Chit, de Ananda, Sat-Chit, Ananda, como gunas de Brahman. Entonces, la tradición Vaishnava piensa y sostiene que Brahman tiene un aspecto saguna, con cualidades, que es último, en el sentido que es el más elevado. Detrás de eso no es que hay uno sin gunas, sin cualidades, sino que ese es el más elevado. Entonces Dios tiene su forma. Y por esto también uno de los nombres que se le da a Dios es Bhagavan. Y ahí en el término Bhagavan tenemos un sufijo posesivo, Bhat, un nominativo es Van, y sobre el término Bhaga. Que Bhaga se puede tomar como otro término para cualidad. Otro término que se le da a Dios es Ishvara, que hace alusión a su poder, porque ¿cuál puede ser el mayor poder que un ser puede tener? Bueno, crear un universo, y como Dios crea el universo, entonces también es caracterizado como poderoso. Ahora, la razón, dicen los pensadores Vaishnavas, nos puede llevar a considerar que detrás de esta creación tiene que haber una inteligencia creadora. Ahora, la razón no nos va a decir qué tipo de razón es esta razón creadora, o cuántas razones son estas razones creadoras. Entonces, si nosotros queremos saber más acerca, perdón, no razón creadora, sino inteligencia creadora, si nosotros queremos saber más acerca de esta inteligencia creadora, tenemos que dirigirnos, dicen los teólogos, a la revelación. Entonces, Ishvara, para los teólogos, manifiesta y revela sus bhagas, sus cualidades, sus propiedades, ¿sí? Y en algunos textos se habla de 6 bhagas, en otros de infinitos bhagas. Uno podría ser la omnisciencia, otro la omnipotencia, y estos son fáciles de aceptar porque si pensamos que Dios crea un universo, bueno, tiene que ser completamente poderoso y completamente omnisciente para conocer todo aquello que crea y para poder crear todo lo que se crea. Pero una de esos bhaga es la forma, en términos sánscritos es rupa.
Oh, I got there, yeah.
¿Por qué?
I didn't get to that thing.
No. Entonces la pregunta, no, I'm just saying what you said. La pregunta es ¿por qué se le atribuye este bhaga a Dios?
Thank you, Gabriel. How much time do we have? 10 minutes.
Yeah, 20 minutes.
20 minutes, okay. So, okay, so therefore, and by the way, obviously we're talking about God with form. Whether there's a God in the first place is a whole other separate discussion that Nyaya tradition engages in. So our talk is going to assume our talk is situated in the traditions that accept that there is a God in the first place. If there is a God in the first place, why should that God have a form? Okay, obviously, whether there's a God in the first place, so you have 2,000 years of dialogue between Buddhists and Mimamsas and Jains on one side, and Vedantins and Nyayikas on the other. So we're not. That's a whole separate. That would be a whole separate discussion. So we're interested in the Vaishnava traditions that accept that God does have a form. So, and here I really hesitate to do this because my whole project, my whole spiel, my whole philosophy of religion ideology is you have to present a tradition in its own terms and its own categories. But here I borrow a category from Anselm, because it's there all over the Vaishnava texts, but it's not systematized. And it's called perfect being theology, also because I wish to communicate with Christian theologians and Western philosophers of religion. Anselm posited, great theologian, perfect being, right? That if there is a God, God must be a perfect being. Most theists would accept that. I mean, you could say, well, why? Philosopher of religion would say, why? Why can't God be an imperfect being? Fine. And of course, you can argue anything. That's fair enough. That's a philosophical response. That's perfectly legitimate. But on the grounds theism, pretty much all theistic traditions are going to say God is a perfect being. You don't really want to have a God that's imperfect, but you could. Okay, let's go with. Well, let's just accept, for argument's sake, that God is a perfect being. Now, Anselm's definition of that is that being than whom nothing greater can be conceived. Okay, so if you say God is great and powerful, but some other being is more powerful, then the first being can't be God. The second being has more of a right. Okay, so I'll say it again. Anselm's definition of the core of perfect being theology goes back to the Greeks, and it takes many twists and turns. Augustine's Anselm definition of a perfect being is that being than whom, weird syntax, sounds good like this, than whom nothing more perfect can be conceived. If that is God, can't conceive of anything more perfect. And we're going to take that and we're going to apply it to our interest in a God with form. And the next thing that I will propose.
Muchas gracias.
Is it good? Is this copy than which no better copy can be conceived?
Yes.
It's not Dunkin' Donuts, right? Not Dunkin' Donuts. It's not Starbucks. Not Starbucks.
El café de McPancho es el café del cual no se puede tomar ningún mejor café.
Thank you.
Disculpen. Pensamos que habíamos terminado. O sea,
I'll just I'll have one more.
azúcar, por favor.
What is this then?
Sugar.
What was that?
¿Tenés más azúcar? Gracias. Sugar. Más azúcar no tenemos. Ahí va, gracias. No.
Oh. No, it's okay.
¿Cuánto es?
So after this, one more statement, and then I want to honor your time, and we're running late, a little bit late.
Bueno, yo mientras voy traduciendo. El doctor Bryant hace un paréntesis. Gracias. Un paréntesis que esta discusión acerca de si Dios va a ser concebido con forma o sin forma, bueno, presupone la existencia de Dios, ¿no? Y nos comenta que la discusión acerca de, bueno, si Dios existe no es una discusión que se dio efectivamente en la tradición india, y que podemos decir que de un lado teníamos a las tradiciones budistas, Mimamsa y del jainismo, que negaban, y algunas corrientes santias que niegan la existencia de Dios, y del otro lado tenemos a las corrientes vedantas, de las cuales el vaishnavismo es una o varias ramas, a los ñaya, etc. Sí, de hecho, la filosofía ñaya se dedica a argumentar acerca, a defender la existencia de Dios. ¿Sí? Entonces, bueno, ese paréntesis de que la discusión que se adelante acerca de que Dios concebido como forma o con forma presupone la existencia de Dios, que es otra discusión que también se dio en el marco de la filosofía dialéctica. Okay. Y por otra parte, él siempre promueve caracterizar y explicar y discutir una tradición recurriendo a sus propias categorías, ¿no? De todos modos, él recupera una categoría que no pertenece a la tradición del hinduismo, sino que toma del pensamiento de Anselmo, que es un teólogo cristiano, que se suele llamar la teología del ser perfecto, ¿no? Que básicamente sostiene que si hay un Dios, este debe ser perfecto. Desde la perspectiva de la filosofía de la religión, se podría discutir esta presuposición, ¿no? Bueno, ¿por qué no concebir a un Dios como imperfecto? Pero, por lo general, todas las teologías aceptan que el Dios que aceptan es perfecto, ¿no? Entonces, esta teología de la perfección divina sostiene que Dios es aquel ser del cual no se puede concebir nada más perfecto.
Okay, that's the important part. The being than which nothing more perfect can be conceived. I worked with the Bhagavad Gītā, the Krishna story, for 45 years. And in the 10th book of the Bhagavad Gītā, the story of Krishna comes from the 10th book of the Bhagavad Gītā. That's the, it's a Kavya epic, actually. It should be called an Itihasa. It doesn't matter. Omnipotence, omniscience are covered by Krishna's power of Yoga Maya. The Bhagavatam has no interest in Ishwarya and in generic qualities of God. Generic qualities of God are omniscience, omnipotence. Those two Christians may add omnibenevolence and some, triad of things. The Bhagavad Gītā lists the qualities, 64 qualities. Omnipotence, omniscience right at the bottom of the list. No interest at all. Because Krishna covers his Ishwarya, his power and his omniscience. Why? In order to allow bhakti. Bhakti means intimacy, and intimacy means the removal of power. This power creates fear, distance, it creates you read the Old Testament, prophets of the Old Testament are terrified. So that's not my main point. The main stress in the Bhagavad Gītā 10th book is Krishna's beauty. Beauty, always repeated, his lotus eyes, his lotus hands, his lotus face, he's beautiful, everybody adores him, gazing, right? Omnipotence, omniscience completely concealed. Now, let's go with Anselm. What is more beautiful? Remember, God is that being, than whom nothing more perfect can be conceived. What is more perfect? A beautiful God or a not beautiful God? Now, if you say not beautiful, well, then you might have a bit of a problem there. But if you say beautiful God is more perfect than a non-beautiful God, well, in Sanskrit, the term for beauty is the same as the term for form. Beauty manifests in form. We're talking about visual beauty, not talking about musical beauty or, gastronomic. The term beauty in English is stretched a bit, but the term rupa in Sanskrit is the same term for rupa. Beauty is the same term for form. So by that logic, by that Anselmian principle, the first step is to say, well, a beautiful God is more perfect than a non-beautiful God. Therefore, God must be beautiful. Therefore, God must have a form. Now, we haven't finished that. We've got to do one more, because you still have all the problems that Aristotle identified. Well, is it form reducible and limited? We'll get to that next. But for now, let's just throw that proposal on the table, that for God to be perfect, God must be beautiful. Therefore, God must have a form. Let's throw that out there, and then one more follow-up to that to respond to the Greek problem, which is inherited by Christians, and then we'll go to the talk. Open it for questions.
Muy bien, entonces el doctor Bryant retoma un Purana, que es un texto del hinduismo, ¿sí? Un especial que es Bhagavad Gītā, y en su capítulo 10 encontramos todas las historias de Krishna, de su infancia, y él comenta que este texto debería ser caracterizado como itihasa, porque se puede pensar como cavia, pero bueno, deja eso de lado. Y en este texto, si bien se enumeran 64 cualidades de Krishna, de Dios, en esa lista la omnipotencia, la omnisciencia están en último lugar. Y por lo general las historias aparecen completamente cubiertas por su yoga maya, su poder yógico. Bueno, la omnipotencia cubierta por el poder yógico me parece un poco contradictorio, pero bueno, este poder divino es oculto en las historias, en el personaje, digamos, Krishna, el personaje de la historia, de Dios Krishna, porque el poder, la omnipotencia, despierta en las personas el temor, tomar distancia. Pensemos en el Antiguo Testamento, pensemos en Bhagavad Gītā, en el capítulo 11, donde la forma divina se revela a Arjuna y él tiene incluso nuestro temor porque es una forma terrible, y lo que se subraya, lo que prevalece en estas historias es bhakti, la devoción, y para que pueda florecer la devoción tiene que haber intimidad entre Dios y el devoto, y para que pueda haber esa intimidad y esa devoción, entonces aparece la belleza en primer plano, en las historias, y todo el tiempo se está haciendo énfasis en la belleza de Krishna, en sus ojos de loto, en sus manos de loto. Entonces, si traemos nuevamente la concepción anselmiana de lo que se habló antes, podemos preguntarnos, bueno, ¿qué es más perfecto? ¿Un Dios hermoso o un Dios no hermoso? Si pensamos que es más perfecto un Dios hermoso, entonces tenemos que aceptar que Dios tiene esta forma. Y cabe señalar que el término sánscrito para belleza y para forma es el mismo y es rupa. Con lo cual, si nosotros pensamos que Dios es más perfecto, porque el Dios que tiene belleza es más perfecto, entonces tiene que tener forma, tiene que tener rupa.
Okay, so I'll just say one more thing then. What about the problems raised about morte by the Greeks? First of all, the problem of reducibility. Krishna's forms are not made of property. They are saguna Brahman. Brahman is Sat Chit Ananda. The first teaching of the Bhagavad Gītā, chapter 2, the Gita starts in 2:9. Bhagavad Gītā starts, as a Vedanta text, starts in 2:9. First teachings, Atman cannot be separated, cannot be divided. There's no inside, there's no outside. So these forms are non-reducible because they're not made of matter. This is something that Aristotle, an idea that never occurred to Aristotle. Why should it occur to Aristotle? This is why God's nature has to be revealed, because human reason, why would human reason suppose that, oh, maybe God does have a form, maybe it's not material. Human reason can only deal with matter. Reason can only deal with empiricism, observation, and then based on observation, you make inferences. That's what human reason is. That's what science is. That's what philosophy is. You can see your senses perceive things, and based on that perception, you either recognize things you perceive, or you make inferences from them, like Big Bang. You perceive the universe is expanding, and therefore you infer that it must have come from some point moment. So the reason then can only come up with categories that are based in matter. So therefore, if you're using reason like Aristotle and even some Indian Nyayikas, by the way, then all form, all known form, all perceived form, all forms that we know of are matter. Therefore, all form is matter. You make an inference, right? You know the inference, right? All smoke comes from fire. All known smoke comes from fire. You see smoke, therefore it must come from fire. So it's a legitimate. So reason therefore presents the proposal. All form is material. Revelation, however, which is a different episteme, the Vedantins say, if reason doesn't take you there, if those truths which are not accessible to sense perception and reason derived from them can only be revealed. The Bhagavad Purana presents itself as a revelation, and in that revelation, reason would never come up with this. The proposal is that the form of Krishna is not made of matter, it is made of Satchidananda Brahman. Immediately, you remove the problem of reducibility. Second, we still have a second problem, limitation. Form is here, not there. Well, Krishna can infinite, all forms of Ishvara can manifest infinite forms. And Krishna is dancing with the gopi. Each gopi has her own Krishna. It's not there's one Krishna. There's an infinity of forms, number one. Number two, form is not a limitation because form pervades, Shakti pervades the whole universe. Shakti is an extension of form. It's like light is an extension of the sun. So you could say, on the one hand, the sun is limited, it's sitting in one place, but its Shakti pervades everything, and its Shakti is omnipresent. So therefore, form, based on those two, and there's other reasons as well, but those two criteria, A, that a form can exude an impersonal extended presence in the form of Nirguna Brahman and be omnipresent, number one, and the form itself can manifest in an infinity of forms, not just Krishna forms, but Vishnu forms, Narayan forms, an infinity of forms, Shiva forms, and those forms can enter into a Murti avatar. There can be so many infinite. So therefore, form is not a limitation on those two grounds, and that's it. Non-reducible, and forms another limitation. And I think one of my secret hidden agendas, although I have to be careful, is I can't say this. Is what would Christian theologians, instead of being intellectually colonialized by Hellenistic thought and philo and allegorical methodologies, what would happen if they read the Old Testament literally? Because the Old Testament doesn't say this is an allegory, this is not real. God's voice is simply his presence. God's hand doesn't mean really a hand, it means he reaches out. What if they, what if they jettisoned Aristotle and Platonic categories? Otherwise, what's the point of revelation? And accepted and read the Old Testament through the lens offered by the Bhagavad Gītā, that, you know what, maybe that anthropomorphic Yahweh, who appeared to Yahweh, to Ezekiel and so forth, what if we thought about his form as being non-material, non-reducible, non-limited? Maybe that would allow you to read your scriptures literally instead of subsuming them to human reason, which is kind of the pinnacle of arrogance, maybe. say something provocative y real.
Sí, termino de traducir y vamos a las preguntas. Bueno, retomando ahora Bhagavad Gītā, y nos comenta que en tanto que texto de Vedanta, el Bhagavad Gītā comienza en la estrofa 9 del capítulo segundo, porque el capítulo primero y las primeras estrofas del capítulo segundo están ligadas al aspecto ético proveniente de los Mahabharata. Bueno, ahí encontramos ya esta noción de que Atman no puede ser separado, al Atman no puede ser dividido. Entonces, así como se dice, no puede ser quemado, no puede ser cortado, no puede ser matado. Entonces, así como se afirma esto del Atman, lo mismo conciben los teólogos Vaishnavas de la rupa, de la forma de Dios, porque esa forma no es prakrítica, no es material, digamos, no puede ser dividida. En general, nuestro conocimiento, por las epistemologías de la Indias, puede provenir de tres fuentes diferentes. Una es la sensación. Nosotros percibimos cosas y obtenemos un conocimiento a partir de la sensación. Luego podemos inferir cuestiones acerca de eso que percibimos y llegar a un conocimiento que no estamos percibiendo, pero que está fundado en último término en lo que sí percibimos. Como por ejemplo, hay fuego en la montaña, pero yo lo que percibo es el humo en la montaña, no el fuego en la montaña. Pero toda aquella verdad que no puede ser alcanzada por la sensación ni puede ser inferida a partir de la sensación, tiene que provenir de la revelación. El Bhagavad Gītā, que es el texto del cual se nos hablaba antes, es concebido como un texto revelado, y ahí Krishna es caracterizado como teniendo infinitas formas, ¿sí? Y ahí se dice que sus formas no son prakríticas. Entonces, bueno, tanto que el texto revelado se puede aceptar o no esa verdad revelada, ¿sí? Ahora, ¿cuáles son básicamente los dos problemas que traen aparejado pensar que Dios tiene forma? Bueno, por una parte el hecho de que es limitada, y por otra parte el hecho de que es irreductible la forma, ¿no? Ahora, ya dijimos que no es reductible porque no es prakrítica, tal como el Atman en Bhagavad Gītā se caracteriza como algo que no puede ser quemado, ni cortado, ni matado, y el problema de la limitación es resuelto por los teólogos diciendo que Krishna tiene infinitas formas. No es que es una forma infinita, sino que tiene infinitas formas. Y más aún, de esa forma principal, o de esas infinitas formas, hay una Shakti, como una potencia, que permea la totalidad del universo y que sí es omnipresente. Y también está la concepción, si entendí bien, que hay una presencia impersonal, ninguna Brahman, que se extiende a partir, ¿no? Esa sería la Shakti que se extiende a partir de esta forma divina.
But it is Bhagavan.
Pero también es Bhagavan.
So it is Bhagavan extended, infinitely extended. But that's the formless aspect of Bhagavan.
Claro. O sea que el aspecto sin forma de Bhagavan es subordinado a la forma de Bhagavan, que es un poco lo contrario que hacen las tradiciones que ponen a la sin forma por encima de la forma. Y esta Shakti, esta potencia que se extiende, puede incluso ingresar, como hablábamos antes, en las imágenes, ¿no? Y entonces uno adora ahí a una imagen que está compenetrada de la energía divina. Y por último, el doctor Bryant se pregunta, ¿no? ¿Qué pasaría si los teólogos cristianos leyeran el Antiguo Testamento, no ya con el bagaje intelectual proveniente de la filosofía griega, Platón y Aristóteles, y la metodología exegética alegórica heredada de Filón de Alejandría y de la tradición griega en general, que les permite decir, bueno, cuando el Antiguo Testamento dice la mano de Dios, en realidad está hablando del poder que Dios tiene de operar, ¿no? O cosas por el estilo, interpretaciones alegóricas de la antropomorfismo que encontramos en el Antiguo Testamento. ¿Qué pasaría si los teólogos leyeran el Antiguo Testamento y el antropomorfismo del Antiguo Testamento desde la perspectiva de Bhagavad Gītā, que concibe la forma como no material, como no reductible?
Maybe the colonized might have a theological moment where they could colonize the colonizer, right? Let's say that. Okay, question.
Bueno, muchas gracias y le damos un aplauso. Entonces, bueno, tenemos un rato para preguntas, abrimos el espacio, pedimos que hagan una pregunta cada uno, no cada uno, sino que si quiere hacer una pregunta que haga una, no más. Somos muchos en presencia y virtualmente, así que los escuchamos. Muchas gracias.
And thanks to Gabriel, because I've been working with him for a number of years, and I can speak for like a minute. He has a city, he also has his little Kali Yuga alumna here, but he has a city because I can understand in Italian, and he's really translates in such an excellent way. I could never do this with anyone else. I would have to speak for like 30 seconds, stop, 30 seconds, stop. I can speak for like 3 minutes. And each time I push in the back, that's it. Pushing. Happy. So, thank you.
El profesor Bryant elogió a Gabriel lo bien que traduce y que no podría hacer esto que hizo en esta conferencia con otra persona al lado porque de repente sumo al elogio.
And the problem, and it's a problem. You speak 30 seconds and you break the British. And then you don't come back to the same British, so that's a problem. Not with you.
Some special power.
Yeah, he has a city for the city.
Y practice yoga.
Yeah.
Clarificadora. Es muy clarificadora la traducción que hace él.
Yes.
¿Alguna pregunta para el doctor Bryant?
Yes. Aquí.
El concepto de Espíritu Santo para... ¿De dónde viene? Porque si no viene de esta cuestión científica de hacer la figura de Dios.
I mean, it comes from Nicaea, that at the time of the 4th century, the idea of the Trinity becomes established. It takes 400 years for this to be accepted by the whole, there were councils and debates, there were many different Christian communities. So the notion of that the Trinity has been one, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, right? Spiritus Sancto, Filio, it's the same as God. That it doesn't become normative until Nicaea. But so that's one point. Can I just take your question and take it in a different direction? If Catholics can accept Trinity, 3 and 1, Hindus would say 3. Why not an infinity in 1? The minute you accept 2 in 1, you've opened the door. And if God is unlimited, who wants to talk about 3? Let's just go with infinity in 1. And that is the Indian monotheistic, nothing to do with polytheism. Catholics don't think they're polytheistic. Unitarians say that. Unitarians will say, you guys are polytheists. Where's this 3? Unitarian. So if Trinitarianism can survive the critique of Unitarianism, then the Hindus are going to knock on the door and say, oh, well, you've accepted that. Let's open the door. Why you want to limit God? How about an infinitarianism? Infinitariety rather than the trinity. Let's have an infinity. Right? In one. Sorry if I hijacked your question. But yeah, Nicaea is when it becomes established. De Santos Vivita.
¿Entiendes? ¿No? Bueno, la noción de Espíritu Santo necesita unos siglos para volverse normativa en la tradición cristiana y se vuelve el concilio de Nicea, siglo IV. Bueno,
sí,
Nicea. Y ahí está la noción de lo divino como una trinidad. Ahora, el profesor plantea, bueno, pero si planteamos a la noción de lo divino como unicrino, si podemos aceptar que la unidad es a la vez una trinidad, el pensamiento hindú diría, bueno, ¿por qué trinidad? ¿Por qué limitarlo a 3? Que sea infinito. Si ya en el momento en que decimos que la unidad es dos y no meramente uno, ya abrimos la puerta a que sea una infinidad.
But
Y eso es lo
infinity
que
is
hace.
forms, not an impersonal infinity. And
Claro.
let's keep our eye on our topic. An infinity of forms. Everybody accepts infinity, but not a monistic infinity. Santo Spirito and Jesus Christ are forms. So, but maybe not the Santo Spirito, but anyway.
San Francisco de Asís no plantea también como una ampliación de ese fenómeno de Dios a través de la naturaleza, como más allá de esa complejidad.
San Francesco il mio Ishta Devata in Hinduism, comprende Ishta Devata qui parla tema. Ishta Devata is your form of Ishvara that has captured your heart in the expression. In the Christian tradition of San Francesco, my name is Edwin Bryant. But what did you say? Is that something about natural?
¿Podrías repetir la pregunta, por favor?
Sí, San Francisco de Asís no plantea como otra idea del fenómeno de Dios que sale para la Trinidad y las cosas a través de los fenómenos de la naturaleza, como que Dios es más que esa Trinidad.
I think San Francisco is a Catholic. He's a Catholic, so he accepts the Trinity. I check that.
Pero al no reconocer que Dios se expresa en la naturaleza, como
God expresses itself in nature. So doesn't that concept of God go beyond the mere Trinity as something beyond nature?
I would say the notion of God as Trinity goes beyond God in nature.
okay.
So God in nature is Shakti, okay, but then what's the Shakti man? So there's Shakti, right, which is presence, divine presence everywhere, fine. So God is in nature. Where does it come? What is the source of that? So that's where we come up. That's where we have Ishvara and Bhagavan, and that's why we end up with God with form, if you're right. But everybody accepts that God pervades nature. Otherwise, what pervades nature? Otherwise, what is the cause of nature? What is the animating feature of nature? If it's not God, then it's something else. Well, then God isn't God anymore because it's got a competitor. So everybody will accept that God pervades nature. But you know, you can worship God in nature. You know, there are deists, there are different quasi-Christian traditions that say, oh, we don't know anything about God before, but we will accept God in nature. There's a kind of spiritualism called deism, yeah. So there are, if that's your way of relating to God, there are systems that accommodate that. Yeah.
I have a question from the.
Did you get that? You understand?
¿Necesitas traducción?
No,
No, no.
Okay.
We have a question
Yeah,
here de Manuel. Manuel Ato, gracias por escucharnos a todos y te escuchamos, Manuel, tu pregunta.
Gracias, Gabriel, por la invitación y la traducción excelente, y al doctor Bryant también por su presentación. Espero se me escuche bien. Tenía dos preguntas. La primera sobre la última parte de la exposición, conforme a la cual la noción de la divinidad sin forma sería, en algunos sistemas, una manifestación subordinada a la divinidad con forma. Sobre eso quería saber cuál es la racionalidad detrás de esta figura, qué utilidad o qué necesidad o qué explica que la divinidad con forma se manifieste como sin forma cuando lo hace, ¿no? Y la segunda pregunta ya tiene que ser más con...
Vamos con una
¿sí?
a la vez, Manuel. Sí, empezamos.
You know, it's Kali Yuga, we have very weak memories.
Since you need translation of the question, well, about this notion that there is a formless Shakti that emanates from the form.
Yeah.
So Manuel understood correctly.
Yeah.
That is a theological proposition.
Yeah.
What role does it play in the theological system? Why do they postulate this, and what's the purpose?
Because
Because
God has to be infinite, and God has to sustain the universe. Like what sustains the universe? Something has to sustain the universe. Has to be a power and intelligence that sustains the universe. Yeah, Nyaya there has to be someone who oversees karma. That's something Christian theologians wasn't part of their requirement for God. But somebody has to be sustaining, maintaining. Most theists would accept that. And somebody has to be overseeing karma. So there has to be but that can't exhaust God, because if God is only a sustaining presence, then you have an impersonalism, and then you have a kind of deism, which the young lady was talking about. Well, that's one thing. And number two, very interesting, the Krishna tradition would say, if God is the sustainer and overseer of the universe, he's trapped. He's trapped by dharma, same as you and I are trapped by dharma. If he has to create, he is now, you could say, out of his will, he accepts that situation, but you now have a God who's kind of stuck in a kind of duty, the same as we are. So the very interesting aspect of the Krishna tradition is that Krishna just enjoys love with his bhaktas in his divine realm, and when it's time for creation, he manifests Vishnu as the creator, Shiva as the destroyer, but ultimate causal God doesn't have a job to do, doesn't have to create and oversee and sustain and so forth. He plays. And the 10th book of the Bhagavad Purana is supposed to be a window. What does that look like? What does God's interaction with his bhaktas in the kingdom of God look like? So that's in addition to what you were asking. But did some of that answer your question?
Yes, by all means. Thank you so much.
Okay, what's the second one?
La traduzco, hago la traducción. Bueno, la pregunta se entendió porque la hizo en español, y la respuesta es que Dios sí tiene que tener este poder infinito de sostener al universo, de ser una inteligencia que guía al universo, que tiene que poder supervisar el karma que opera en todos los seres del universo, pero no puede ser solamente eso, porque si fuera solamente eso ya sería un impersonalismo y además sería una energía inmanente y sería un deísmo, pero no es la tesis defendida por los teólogos Vaishnavas. Además,
You don't even need personality for that. You could just start talking about power, like gravity.
claro, ni siquiera se necesitaría de una personalidad divina,
Mimamsa would say.
como diría, por ejemplo, Mimamsa, una de las corrientes de la filosofía de la India. Ahora bien, si Dios además es concebido solamente como esto,
Como
entonces,
creador.
como creador, entonces quedaría atrapado a su dharma de crear y de regir inteligentemente el universo y supervisar el dharma. Pero no es concebido de esa manera por la tradición Vaishnava,
You can't
sino
say
que
he's completely free if he has every cycle, he has to wake up, Krishna has to wake up, okay, alarm clock goes off, okay, great. Then how is he fully independent? That's the real being, right? So therefore,
no se podría afirmar la libertad de Dios porque tiene que crear al final de cada ciclo, tiene que destruir al universo después de cada ciclo y luego crear un nuevo universo cada ciclo, entonces él también está limitado por su propio dharma y por lo tanto no es libre. Entonces, los teólogos Vaishnavas lo que dicen es, bueno, no, Krishna, que es esta forma divina, se dedica a amar a sus devotos y a jugar, y cuando es necesario el proceso creador o el proceso destructor, entonces manifiesta Vishnu que crea o manifiesta Shiva que destruye. Y la Bhagavad Purana es una ventana que nos muestra cómo sería esa relación de Krishna y sus devotos en el reino divino. Goloka.
segunda pregunta.
Muchas gracias. Sí, la segunda pregunta ya tiene que ver más sobre la evaluación de los estudios de filosofía de la India en Estados Unidos. Esta conferencia parte de la premisa de que hay una temática relevante que no se está considerando en el medio académico, pero claro, es una situación en realidad envidiable desde el punto de vista de América Latina, donde en los programas de filosofía, la filosofía de la India apenas aparece, si es que aparece, como un curso electivo. Entonces, en general, la pregunta iba por el lado de una evaluación suya sobre cómo están evolucionando los estudios sobre filosofía de la India en los programas académicos de filosofía en los Estados Unidos. En lo personal, aquí en Perú, siento que a veces hay más receptividad sobre los estudios de la filosofía de la India en los programas de estudios de religión y teología que en los programas de filosofía mismos. No sé si algo similar ocurre en Estados Unidos, no sé si quizás convendría pensar en fusionar ambos departamentos de estudios religiosos y filosofía. En fin, mi pregunta iba más por una evaluación acerca de cómo están evolucionando este campo de estudios, ¿no?
Yes, he's asking for your personal assessment about the Indian philosophy studies in North America and how you think they are evolving in academia, because here we perceive that situation as, as something good, because here the Indian philosophy is near an optative subject, but there you have optative or elective.
Well, this is there too.
Well, and one thing that he asks is if you think that because here Indian philosophy studies are better received in theology departments and religious departments, not in philosophy.
I can't answer the second question. I only know Gabriel. So,
but what's your assessment about the Indian studies in North America, not here?
Well, are you talking about philosophy departments or religion departments? In religion departments, you'll find Hinduism represented not very philosophically, but there's certainly Hinduism is on the curricula of any major university that has a Hinduism, that has a religion department. In general, the humanities are on decline, by the way. Since I've been in academia 25 years or more, humanities have massively on the decline. But there is representation of Hinduism. What's very interesting now, the last year or two, the Jain community, which is only a small community in India, maybe 20 million, they are funding chairs, $1 million, whatever it is, and funding chairs so the university doesn't have to come up with the money. And then, so it's a good time to be in Jain scholarship. And the Hindus haven't quite started, they're going to wake up and say, whoa, wait a minute, the Jains are doing this. So that's where you're going to get, I think, in the next couple of years, Hindus are also already started a little bit. They're going to start funding chairs. The problem is that the university has to have autonomy over who's hired. Now, the Hindus don't want to hire someone who's a Marxist or a Freudian who's going to say, oh, Krishna Lila, come up with some Freudian, theoretical way of looking at it. They want someone that's obviously they're going to come up with $1 million or $2 million. They want someone that at the very least is going to respectfully present the tradition. So there's a bit of tension there, which has caused a number of offered chairs to be declined because the Hindu donors want to have some kind of say in who gets hired, because there are people who will present Hinduism through categories that Hindu would resist. In philosophy departments, so that's religion departments, the philosophy departments are waking up to how myopic their idea of philosophy is. They have the audacity, well, let me turn that down. They presume to have departments of world philosophy, and there's not any representation of non-Western traditions. So there's a myopia that philosophy, and it goes back to the Greeks, by the way. You can see this this presumption in Greek. The Greeks are saying, where does our philosophy come from? It comes from the barbarians, it comes from the Egyptians. No, it's Greek. And what makes it philosophy? Well, we follow truth wherever it takes. We don't start off with a dogma. So what's happening in Rutgers has actually the best philosophy department in the world. Sometimes it's number one, sometimes it's number two with NYU, New York. Okay, so I'm not in the philosophy department. They have dozens and dozens, big department, well-funded. I don't know how many faculty, a lot. Not a single non-Western. So philosophy departments are waking up that this is not okay in the 21st century. So they're scrambling for some token non-Western philosopher. It starts off like that, which is a good sign. It doesn't matter what you know. Typically, and this is connected to my gripe, to my concern, typically Buddhism is the token for non-Western philosophy, because for the reasons I tried to touch upon, Hinduism is not considered to have the same intellectual ingredients, the same kind of intellectual possibilities as Buddhism. So typically, and what Buddhism means, Madhyamika. So typically Nagarjuna, etc. So typically, but that's okay, because that opens the door. Because Nagarjuna still believes in reincarnation, he's still going to sort of be pushing on Western philosophical categories. And from the Hindu side, slowly there's recognition that there is intellectual content, especially in Nyaya. And of course, monistic Vedanta, so I think within my lifetime, we will see much more, only simply from being politically correct, and also because of the huge Indian diaspora in America. We're going to see the doors are opening. It's a very good time to get a PhD in Indian philosophy, in my opinion. Yeah, because it really is. Because the philosophy departments say they're like, oh my God, we need to get, this is not okay. We need to get some non-Western philosopher in. And you guys doing PhDs in philosophy?
Well, some of us are trying to get one.
Well, if you are, make sure you get some courses that are non-Western, and you can apply to Rutgers places. So it's the best thing is you have some curriculum, have some analytic philosophy, have some credentials, and then show that you can teach Indian philosophy, Buddhist, and so forth. And that's the best way to start, is to have show that you have all of the qualifications of the Western Academy, but you have the ability to teach Indian courses. That's the place to start. And then once you get in, you create your courses, and then slowly the doors open. That's a very long answer, so I apologize. But if there's students here, you might think about that. It's a good time.
Entonces piensen en estudiar filosofía de la India.
I don't know about South America.
Mundial, y por lo menos en Estados Unidos se está abriendo el panorama tanto en los departamentos de religión como en los departamentos de filosofía. Los de filosofía tardan un poco más, pero también, sobre todo budismo, Nyaya y las tradiciones de Vedanta monista, ¿no? Son las razones que les puso en tu charla.
So you have to take Gabriel's courses, because also the university wants to see how many students are signing. So
we have the Sanskrit chair.
We need to.
We have the Sanskrit chair. Yeah, Gabriela here is present. So we invite you, los invitamos a todos a usar sánscrito.
Otherwise,
They're trying to start in the philosophy department.
Yeah.
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 We will see what happens.
Well, we had to stand with placards. Basta con comunismo intellectual. Basta con la myopic, Western myopia.
¿Alguna otra pregunta?
Sí, yo
Yeah.
Esa apertura a través del budismo, ¿pensás que puede tener que ver con que sea medio funcional a diversas culturas hegemónicas y prácticas?
Is the opening of Buddhism what?
Related to hegemonic practices, or yo creo que tiene que ver con todo lo que expuso, ¿no? Que no hay una concepción de lo divino con forma. So why is Buddhism accepted more than, for example?
It's an interesting question, because Mahayana Buddhism is full of bodhisattvas, and it has all of the, I don't know, we can't use terms like exoticism anymore. That's not okay. But it has all of that. You know what? It's Madhyamika. It's Madhyamika, Nagarjuna. The Madhyamika traditions are very analytical, very rational. And it's the Madhyamika traditions that are opening the door. Right? Not other types of Buddhism, not Yogacara, not Zen, none of that. It's the Indian, specifically Nagarjuna and Chantarakshita and Madhyamika, highly intellectualized. Even though is it philosophy? If we define philosophy as having no starting point, which is a myth, because everybody, even in the West, you have a canon, Aristotle, Plato, you can't get a degree unless you follow the Sampradaya, you have to follow the lineage, you got to read Aristotle, you got to read Descartes, you got to read Kant, right? So you have a lineage, but if you want to create a fiction that real philosophy has no preconditions, which is a myth, even Nagarjuna starts off with the acceptance of the teachings of the Buddha. So in that sense, if you want to say philosophy, you're going to have no starting point. Even Madhyamaka would fail. But I think philosophers are realizing, well, everybody has a starting point. And anyway, so the Madhyamaka is opening that door. Yeah, I would say.
Muchas veces se caracteriza al budismo como ateo, ¿no? Que para mí es una caracterización equivocada. El budismo no es ateo, en alguna medida el budismo es politeísta. Pero los dioses, ¿no? This is maybe a question. Los dioses también están sujetos al surgimiento condicionado, digamos, a todo lo mismo que está sujeto. Yes.
Parliamo italiano, dai. Tutti gli italiani che sono venuti in Argentina, dai, tutti i nomi italiani. Martino, che è italiano? Chi c'erano italiani? Dai, italiani, sulla mano, forza ragazzi. Ok,
Buddhism is characterized as atheist in many the books of Indian philosophy. So I think that might help.
So true.
As Samkhya is characterized as atheist, and they say that the atheist Samkhya is earlier than theist Samkhya because it's more radical. So I think those are the same positions playing there.
Just piggybacking on that. Theism right now is not cool. Either in the yoga, New Age marketplace or in academics studies philosophy departments. The pendulum swings backwards and forwards, and right now theism is not considered. When I say cool, I'm using that word because there's no philosophical reason, right? Theism has just as powerful and just as intellectually rigorous argumentations as atheism. So the fact that theism is not it's got nothing to do with intellectual robustness. It's just a matter of cool. So there's coolness. Cool is a nice word in Spanish. Cool. So it's not cool in New Agey yoga kinds of circles, right? Monism is cool. And if you say you're a dualist, all of a sudden, it's a bad word. Why? Nobody can answer that question. And likewise, so this is just a momentary, the pendulum goes here and it goes there. Nothing to give serious attention to. But it is a fact that humanities, Marx and all of the sort of great, most of the theoreticians of the study of religion were atheists. And so that sort of pervaded the humanities. And we don't have to pay attention to that because, like I'm saying, it's a cool factor. And cool factors don't last. Yes.
La aclaración.
Sí. Bueno, yo comenté que el budismo suele ser caracterizado como ateo y eso tal vez ayuda. Entonces el profesor Bryant comentaba que el teísmo, es decir, aceptar que existe Dios, en las humanidades, el ámbito contemporáneo no es cool, o sea, no está de moda, ¿sí? El teísmo. Entonces aquellas corrientes filosóficas teístas no tienen no son percibidas de la misma manera que las que son ateas, ¿sí? Y esto no tiene nada que ver con el rigor intelectual de las corrientes, porque hay el mismo rigor intelectual en las corrientes teístas que en las ateas, ¿sí? Entonces no tiene que ver con eso, tiene más que ver con una moda y modas que están sujetas a la violencia.
It's not cool to spill coffee on your spectacles either. Yes.
Mencionaste que en el siglo XVI los intelectuales bengalíes imponen la Advaita Vedanta como teoría predominante, ¿no? En la India. ¿Atribuís solo a eso o hay algunos otros motivos para que se haya convertido en una filosofía tan preponderante sobre otras, como estas que mencionaste hoy?
I do it with until I was saying that it was used at the moment about Bengal time.
No, is there any other reason apart from the tendency established by the 16th century Christian colonialists? Is there another reason?
Well, Bengal is a new city, right? It's an artificial city. But it was built around trade. It's not a traditional city like Mumbai and Hastinapur, Delhi, right? Not Mumbai. Mumbai is also new, but Madras. So therefore, it was a city built around trade. So therefore, it was a city that attracted people, Indians, and the Indians that went there, the fact that they went there and they associated with militias and meat eaters and Westerners meant that they were departing from traditional contexts. And some of them had histories, who knows? Okay, so the question is, so they, we can tell from that, are there other reasons other than, I feel a very strong reason is the conversation with Westerners. Because if you're an Advaita Vedantin, you can say, oh, yes, there's these religious, they worship, but really, Brahman is beyond all of that. So, and Vivekananda, obviously, a major spokesperson, but it's interesting because the Brahma Samaj was anti-Advaita. So Rajaram Mohan Roy and the early Brahma Samaj, they had a theism that was Christian, really. It was basically God, it was a personal God, but not the personal God of real life Hinduism. So it was a construct. It was a construct. They were trying to somehow defend it early, before Vivekananda. The very first apologists was the Brahma Samaj. So they were all Western educated. They were Bahus. They went to Christ Church College, so they received the Western education. So they wanted to somehow, create some kind of defense of Hinduism, but it was a defense that was, Upanishads are okay, Gita is okay, very selective. And they were precisely that. They were an interface between Hindu apologetics. So they were stuck on their own because the Hindus didn't recognize their Hinduism and the Westerners didn't really give it much respect. But were there other reasons? From the names of some of the Brahmins that are recorded as having conversations with their teachers, we know some of them came from Advaita backgrounds. So it wasn't just a convenient facade in order so that Westerners can accept. There was a lot of that, but some of them were actually Advaitins. I don't know, I can't say more than that, but Bengal is Vaishnava and Shakta. Pre-colonial Bengal is Shakta, Durga, right, Kali, and Gaudiya Vaishnava. So 500 years, Gaudiya Vaishnavas and Shakta traditions. Those are form traditions. So the natural theological traditions of Bengal before the colonial presence was form. And especially Gaudiya Vaishnavism, where form is ultimate. Shakta traditions, form is there, but not ultimate. So that's interesting. So therefore, when the British start to build their trend, city of Calcutta develops, the Brahmins are coming. Who knows where they're coming from? They're coming because to do business. They're coming as translators. They're coming as clerks. They're coming as administrators. So they're coming from, once the British power becomes significant, they're coming from all over. Yeah, I would say. Some of them are bringing maybe some Advaita flavors, fair enough, but mostly Vaishnava. The Indians mostly Vaishnava or Shaiva. Advaita Vedanta pre-modern times is, where do you go for Advaita Vedanta? You go Sringeri Math, you go down South India. It wasn't as dominant in pre-modern times as it became in the colonial period. So it was appropriated. Why was it appropriated? Because it's convenient. You can defend Hinduism and say, yes, there's all about Hindu stuff. So the Hindus will recognize it. Oh, yes, we can do all pujas, we can do all this. But then they can say, then the intellectual Brahmins can say to the British, oh, by the way, these forms are not real. But don't tell the villagers. So in that sense, it was a convenient discourse, I suggest. Yeah.
Ay, sin embargo, una pregunta, ay, no sé si querés traducir. No, respecto de la tradición doxográfica de la propia India y esta idea de que hay un punto de vista predominante de la Advaita Vedanta, por ejemplo, el Sarvadarsana Sangraha, y cómo esto está siendo contestado también por muchos especialistas, creo que duramos por cierta discusión sobre que no es el punto de vista de la Advaita Vedanta en esa doxografía.
¿Cuál sería la pregunta?
¿Qué cree de esa obra doxográfica?
Sí.
Si realmente hay un punto de vista de la Advaita Vedanta que está organizando los diferentes formas.
En esa obra.
En esa obra o más en general.
Sí, if you believe that in the Sarvadarsana Sangraha, yes, there's a Vedantic point of view, there is Advaita Vedantic point of view organizing the whole discourse. Do you think that
I have
that is
to,
possible?
I'd have to look at it. It's been a long time.
Sí.
From that land, probably. The earliest doxographies, the earliest are Jain and Advaita, and there's a Buddhist one. Jain because it comes about. So that it fits there, yeah. And Advaita because Mithya, it's all Vyavaharika. But Madhava, I think it was in Advaita. I want to say
Yes, because it's not.
No, not Madhava. Not Madhava, Madhava. Yeah, Madhava is the 16th century.
Yes.
Yeah. Not
And the last Darshana it talks about is Advaita Vedanta.
exactly.
So the normal view is
Yes.
that is an Advaita Vedanta.
Yes.
But I believe Bronkhorst, for example, is arguing that it's not.
Okay.
It's a
Well, you have to look at that.
Okay.
But can I use your question to begin to make a point? Part of our project is we collect statistically all the introductions to Indian philosophy, last 300 years. And also the comparative mysticism. The quantitative study now. And we demonstrate how Vedanta is either Vishishta Dvaita that is not represented at all, or it gets 2 pages and Advaita Vedanta gets 50 pages. So quantitatively, we show how non-Advaita Vedanta gets either neglected completely or marginalized in 100 different, introduction, and the same comparative mysticism. They're not interested in Darshan and Krishna. They're not interested in accounts that that you saw, or Shiva. And they actually come out and say, what really triggered the book? We were sitting, sometimes I sit in on philosophy of religion classes, just because we're all students, right? They're sitting in, and there's a comparative mysticism class, and there was a scholar called Stace, and he was talking about mysticism, and he says, basically the perennialism, you want to say that you're trying to defend spirituality, the motive is fine. You want to defend it against reductionists. Reductionists are saying, look at all the different claims, they're all different, that means there's no truth to them. Perennialists want to say, well, actually there is, we get rid of the stories, and underneath there's this sort of monistic essence. To do that, you have to do massive travesty to what the traditions are saying. So this stage says, and the visions of the Virgin Mary, we don't need to consider them because they're not mystically valid. So right there, you have a presupposition that any kind of genuine spirituality can only be monism. So that's what triggered our book. Okay.
Bueno.
Thank you. Yes, so thank you.
Muchísimas gracias a todos.
Take Sanskrit courses, take Indian courses. Otherwise, the department will say, look at the numbers, say 2 people and
Bueno, muchísimas gracias por venir, gracias a todos los que se conectaron virtualmente. Vamos a terminar la sesión. Hasta luego.